Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America here in the middle of the country, Des Moines, Iowa, and the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, which extends to various parts of Iowa. We're grateful to have you listening. If you're listening over the weekend here on Iowa Catholic Radio or on iowacatholicradio.com, but especially our listeners who are tuning in also on podcast. But depending on when people are listening to it, they're either going to be listening on Holy Saturday or on Easter. So we're hoping that depending on what you have been able to participate with the Triduum, that the discussion we're having today hopefully sets the mood as you either prepare for Easter, especially if you're going to midnight Mass or for Sunday morning, or that you're celebrating with us here with the Easter Sunday. But we're talking about eternity, Bud, so I think that it's going to be an okay show for people to contemplate this Easter weekend.
Yeah, this is a tough episode to record because I am kind of scrupulous about not saying Alleluia, Christ is risen too early. So for the Saturday listeners, I want to be cognizant of that. But if you're listening on Sunday, I hope you're feasting already.
That's right. So you can imagine. We don't want to say. We don't want to bleep out the Alleluia because it will make people misunderstand what we're putting there. But it's a very, of course, leading into the most joyous weekend of the year. So it's very exciting for people. Thank you for listening to the show. As always, underwritten by Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu. And so, Bud, I don't know if our students are saying Alleluia quite yet because they got a few weeks left, but it certainly is. The signs and smells of Easter and of course spring outdoors, but I think we're also getting there with the semester as well.
Well, it's crazy how quickly it changed this year because it felt like we were in the heart of winter, and then some days this week just these windows of brilliant weather. But no, it is the home stretch for our students at Mercy College of Health Sciences, so I'm sure their Easter joy will be somewhat restrained until they reach that finish line.
Absolutely. But mchs.edu, go check out mchs.edu, see all of the programs that we have for even the summer, Bud, if that's what people are looking to, but of course starting in fall. But thank you once more, Mercy College of Health Sciences, for underwriting our show. Bud, today we have an interview with Professor Randall Smith down in University of St. Thomas in Houston, correct?
I know, it gets confusing because there's St. Thomas just a few hours north of us, and we've interviewed folks from there. But yeah, so Dr. Randall Smith is at the University of St. Thomas in Houston.
So we're going to be talking about his book, From Here to Eternity. It's reflections on death, so I suppose some people can think it's pretty dour, but specifically for him, the idea is the difference, the understanding of that the resurrection makes. Yeah. So very timely considerations as we wrap up Lent, wrap up Holy Week, and get into the celebration of the high feast of Easter.
Well, when I was preparing for the show, I asked him, I was like, so, was it kind of a downer to write a book on death? And he was very insistent that the book was not only or primarily about death, but as you can tell in the subtitle, also immortality and the resurrection of the body. So very apropos for the Easter season here.
So we're looking forward to interview him. We're grateful that you all are here with us. Make sure to check out not only iowacatholicradio.com if you want to listen, but you are not in radio range, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, but also you can podcast shows there as well. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back to interview Dr. Randall Smith about his book, From Here to Eternity, right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It's wonderful to have you. Wonderful to have our listeners with us, however you might be listening, on Iowa Catholic Radio, iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or, of course, if you're listening to this on podcast. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I'm going to kick it over to you to introduce who we're talking to today.
Yeah, our guest today, we're honored to have on the show Dr. Randall Smith. He's the professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. Dr. Smith, we've got to swap stories about David Devil sometime. I know him from Newman Studies. But he's got his PhD in medieval studies and philosophy from the University of Notre Dame, directed by Ralph McInerney. That's probably some great stories too. He's written a few books, including works on St. Thomas Aquinas, one on Aquinas, Bonaventure, and the scholastic culture of medieval Paris. But his most recent offering is From Here to Eternity, Reflections on Death, Immortality, and the Resurrection of the Body, out by Emmaus Road Academic Press. So, Dr. Smith, thank you for being on the show.
No, it's a great pleasure, particularly because you're in Iowa. And I don't know whether you noticed on my I don't know if you saw my CV, whatever, but my undergraduate degree is from Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa.
Okay.
I have a great deal of, that's where I became Catholic.
Oh, wow.
I have a great deal of love for Iowa. So anyway, anything for Iowa, that's all I can say.
Yeah, Bud and I are both moved into Iowa, but they've all treated us nice. It's been, Bud, around 7 years, and they haven't kicked us out yet.
I grew up in Nebraska.
No, I know the people in Iowa are very, very nice to foreigners. In Texas, you get they're all very nice, Southern hospitality, but they do look at you as, the question I got when I first got here was, so where are you from originally? Right? Because they know, all right, you're not a Texan, right? Anyway, whereas in Iowa, everyone was very, very nice, very sweet.
Yeah, I'm from Oklahoma, so I'm not going to get baited into saying what I really think about Texas. But to your point, the Iowans, no, I'm kidding. The Iowans have treated me very nice. And speaking of eternity in heaven, if Kevin Costner's right, there's at least mistakable parts of Iowa involved in baseball that you might think are heaven if movies from that the Field of Dreams are in anywhere correct.
Yeah. No. Yeah, that's another. We could talk about that at a different time. About the look. I mean, I love Iowa, and I think it's beautiful, and it is close to heaven. But that thing where people sort of romanticize Iowa, but then they don't really like Iowans that much, right? Because they're not liberal. They're not anyway. So, but look, it's all very fine. And I love baseball and I love Iowa, and that's great, right? I'm not a fan of that particular vision of Iowa, but it's all great.
Yeah, not to keep bringing up Iowa, Bud, but I will admit I'm with you. I moved in 2016, and of course, like Iowa is known for all of their the big prelims, right, and the sort of like first part of the nation that's voting for presidents, and so it was really weird to see like every square inch of billboard dedicated to people I didn't even know were running for president. But I don't know if you had that same thing, but. Those are all very earthly matters, but let's turn to eternity itself as the book so properly turns our attention to. Well,
should we go Randall this morning or today or Dr. Smith? What works for you?
Yeah, that's fine. No, Randall is fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, Randall. Yeah, so I ask this question quite often of authors who come on the show, but it's really interested me to explore with you today. What was the inspiration for the book? Writing a book on eternity, how did you get into this topic and say, I want to publish on death, immortality, and the resurrection of the body?
Well, actually, that's a very good question. But I started the book, as I think I say in the introduction, during COVID. And so somebody might, so you were thinking about death. And the answer is, well, yeah, but actually I was thinking about the resurrection of the body. And I had for a bunch of years been thinking about different notions and how the notion of the resurrection of the body was a more important, interesting, reasonable notion of life after death than pretty much anything else on offer. But I have to admit that during COVID, right, everybody was thinking about death, et cetera. And I thought, wow, maybe this is a time where I could write this book and I might actually get readers, right? Yeah. Now, of course, it takes a while for a book to come together and for it to actually get out, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I try to write it very fast and get it out, but that doesn't really happen anyway. So it took a long time to come out. But so it was written during COVID, but thinking that, well, there might be a market for this. But the truth is I had been thinking about this for a very long time, long before COVID. That was an occasion to kind of like, oh, well, now's the time where maybe I should write this stuff down. So anyway, that's sort of not exactly the inspiration for the book, but it's the occasion for the book.
Well, I'm sure COVID was a sort of a fascinating context within which to reflect on these things and write on these things. I think that ties into, there's a quote that you have early on in the book from Pope John Paul II, where he says the answers that we give to the fundamental questions will decide the direction which people seek to give their lives. And you point out in that section that like how we view death, how we think about the afterlife, that really sort of frames our existence or how we understand the meaning of our existence. Could you unpack what John Paul II might have been thinking there and sort of like how you think about that in light of writing the book?
Well, yeah, I teach all my classes in theology this way, actually, inspired by John Paul II. When I first became a Catholic, he was the Pope, and it was a very important part of my conversion, John Paul II. But anyway, at the beginning of Fides et Ratio, his encyclical on faith and reason, he says that, right, about the fundamental questions, and that the answers that people give to these fundamental questions, which will determine the direction they give to their lives, questions such as who am I, where am I from, where am I going, what is happiness, suffering, death, right? I mean, these sort of big questions. And one way of putting it, for example, which I say to my students, because when I'm teaching moral theology, is they say, look, here's an example. If you think it's a dog-eat-dog world, right, a kill-or-be-killed world, well, then that's just the way you're going to live. It doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what the church says. It doesn't matter what Mother Theresa does. You might say, oh, yes, I'm glad Mother Theresa does that stuff, but it's a dog-eat-dog world, right? I mean, and that's the way you're going to live your life because that's the only thing that's going to seem reasonable to you, right? So the other example I give is I say, well, look, if you were an Epicurean in the ancient world, Epicureans didn't believe in an afterlife, as many people now don't believe in an afterlife. Well, then it only makes sense from an Epicurean point of view that you wouldn't think about the afterlife. And then you would say to yourself, well, nothing I do now is of eternal significance. So I should just maximize my pleasure and minimize my pain for as long as I live. And if things get particularly painful, well, then I should just commit suicide. Epicurus started to get what we think maybe were kidney stones or something like that. And it was very painful. So he just got into a warm bath and opened up his, had a nice glass of wine, opened up his veins and bled out and killed himself. We're seeing more and more of that in our culture because people think, well, there's nothing in the afterlife. There's nothing to be worried about. There's no eternal significance to anything. So why would I struggle? So that's the significance, right? The answers to people give to these fundamental questions, it seems to me, does already, whether anybody's considered the fundamental questions or not, the implicit answers people have given to those questions will determine the direction they give to their lives, how they live, what they think is valuable.
So, Randall, I appreciate something very much. I'm glad Bud mentioned the Ralph McInerney connection because actually this all of a sudden, to me, makes sense of a formal decision that you made and how you organized the book. So, from here to eternity, people go like, oh, okay, it's going to talk about death or the afterlife. Well, you structure your book, and I think this is important for people to realize because I think it's the key to how you wanted to proceed with the book, is you start very consciously, with people who don't believe, or they believe that death is final, as it were, and then you separate there's certain types of people who believe that death is final. Some believe you're nothing you can do about it, so you should just live not really worrying about it. There are people who believe it's final, but it's the ultimate thing you need to worry about. Then you get into people who believe that death isn't the final thing, and so they're like transhumanists. They're trying to figure out how to cheat death. And then you move along to people believe in an afterlife but don't have a Christian one. Then finally you land with Christianity, and this is where you get into what I hear from you at the top of this segment, the concern with the resurrection and its defensibility in terms of the very questions about death. So on one hand, that all struck me as I remember Ralph McInerney in different books he's written, that sort of clarity where you can tell he thought long and hard about how to proceed with the argument because that was going to help people understand where he was starting and where he was going. But that sort of narrative element, and I mean, it's not completely a narrative element. It's not like you're telling a story throughout the whole thing, but the idea is once you get done with a book like this and consider the question of the resurrection of the body, you have a path you've, so to speak, have walked down in reading this book. I guess my question is, am I reading way more into this, or is this precisely what you were hoping that people see, so that when they understand talking the defensibility of the Christian position, that it's not like we're wildly throwing out a non-rational claim of the faith, but that faith is in fact informing these questions that have been at the very heart of philosophical considerations about death from the beginning.
No, that's exactly right. Actually, it's one of those wonderful times where somebody repeats back to you exactly what you wanted them to get out of the book.
Okay, good.
So thank you. But the other thing, of course, that people don't know, Ralph McInerney was a famous philosophy professor at the University of Notre Dame and a well-known, as it were, we may say, disciple of Thomas Aquinas and writer on Thomas Aquinas, and a remarkably clear mind. And I can't even begin to, compare myself to the great Ralph McInerney. He was, there are many, many wonderful stories there. But in any case, so yes, that and Thomas Aquinas and other great Thomists, Joseph Pieper, and Maritain and others are inspirations. In other words, and to put it, I don't know, broadly speaking, a sort of philosophical approach to a theological topic.
Right. Yes. Thank you.
Meaning, I want people to sort of, but not philosophy in like professional philosophy or something, but connecting to these fundamental questions. It's another thing John Paul II talked about, restoring the sapiential dimension to philosophy, right? Philosophy as a search for the ultimate wisdom about these fundamental questions, rather than just very small topics of, logic issues, which are all important, but, to have the courage to go out. And again, that's kind of an inspiration. And when I read these marvelous books by, again, Romano Guardini and Joseph Pieper and others, I'm struck by that, right? And Ralph McInerney. But so I thought, yeah, you're exactly right. I thought, well, these are big questions. What are the possible ways that you could approach this question about death and the afterlife, right? Like, is there one? Is there not one? And of course, some people think in the world have been believers in an afterlife, and other people haven't been believers in an afterlife, right? Some people have thought, well, the way you get around the problem of death has oftentimes been considered a problem, somehow, right? Like, oh, who really wants to die? People who are in despair, yes, but generally people value life. And so you might say, how about living on and on and on forever? And that has been a suggestion people have made, right? Eternal life, immortality. That's why one of the titles of the book is Immortality. If you look at the ancient world, they think about this a lot, actually. There are a lot of stories, myths, about eternal life, all of them turning out very badly.
Right.
Right. They understood this was not a good idea. Okay. Because it brings boredom. It brings aging. It brings forgetfulness. It's just not a good idea, right? So I repeat some of those warnings from the ancient world about immortality, although we have many people, as you point out, there's a chapter on transhumanism, who think that, the thing we ought to do is just extend human life for, another 50 or 100 or 150 years. And the answer is, well, okay, but you're still going to have to, even if you were able to do that, you're still going to have to face death.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in the second. Like when we get to the second segment, I really want to bring up something about that. But yeah, keep going. Sorry.
But then you sort of say, well, then people sort of say, as I say in the beginning of the book, generally people have thought that you need some notion of the afterlife for this life to be meaningful or to seem meaningful at all. Because if all you've done, all you've struggled for, all your relationships, the people you've loved, if at the end it's just oblivion, nothingness, well, that seems to make everything before meaningless, empty, right? You're headed nowhere for no reason. And so people don't like that view, and have then sort of thought from very, very early on that there's something that goes beyond death. There's something infinite in the human spirit that somehow transcends death. But then you need a notion of the afterlife, which doesn't make this life meaningless either. So if you go on, right, and you sort of say, well, what's the afterlife like? Well, here would be a problem, for example, if you said, here's an obvious one, okay, which is if you said, well, you're supposed to be celibate and care about people and respect, and then what happens in the afterlife? Well, you get sex with 76 virgins. Well, it's like, well, but that notion of the afterlife is completely contrary to the moral vision you have for this life, right? And that could be true in any number of ways. Like, so what are people doing in the afterlife? Or if you say, well, the afterlife is just this glorious paradise, et cetera, and you get to go there and whatever, and then you get to forget about everybody in this world. Somebody might say, so if heaven's so good, why don't we just get there? What are we messing around here for? What is this life about, right? Like, if heaven is so great, why do we spend any time at all here? Just so we'll mess up, so then God can send us to hell if we mess up? That doesn't make much sense either, right? So again, the notion you have of the afterlife, it seems to me, is also very important. It's important in the way you live your life, and it's important, to have an adequate notion of the afterlife to make this life meaningful, or right, to give meaning to this life, to make it understandable about the way we're asking people to live.
Yeah, this reminds me of so John Henry Newman in his, I think it's the first plain and parochial sermon, he makes this whole point where he's like, look, what you're doing in this life and why not everyone's going to go to heaven essentially is not because God's punitive, but this life is made to habituate yourself to even liking heaven. And so that, like, if you spend this time in your life not getting in the habit of loving the worship of God, heaven itself, you may as well go to hell because it will, grate at your eternal nerves, as it were. And this makes me think of my Ralph McInerney story, which is singular because, I only got a chance to communicate with him once. I sent him an email asking him some technical question about Etienne Gilson, because I'm a nerd. And so I'm very happily...
Another great Thomas.
Yeah,
great Thomas.
So
yeah.
I see that the great Ralph McInerney has written back an email. And, I don't know him from anything. I don't even know how he's doing or anything like this. I just see his email. And he writes back this delightfully wonderful, very clear and encouraging email. And then the next week I found out he passes away. So, like, up to the end, right, what Ralph McInerney was trying to fulfill, like you said, this office of the philosopher, the wise man trying to help direct people towards the truth. And, of course, like, that's what we're supposed to do, right? Like, at the end, like, hopefully heaven's going to be not exactly, but a lot like what we were at the end, because that's what we're working towards, is being able to enjoy heaven itself. And so that's one more time where I think your book, in its way of having a path intellectually, philosophically to tread, that hopefully that also is what is in store for people who take your book, read it and take it seriously, is it's not just a position paper, but the process of going through, starting where you do and ending up where you do, is itself instructive of what you're trying to get the reader to understand about death and eternity.
Yeah, and what I want them also then to say, I mean, people oftentimes say to me, so I have this elderly grandfather, should I send this book to him? And I say, well, look, I want to sell books, okay, but... so yeah, sure, get it for your grandfather. But then, look, it's a book on death, but it's not a how-to manual, right? I mean,
right.
It's not a book about, like people who are about ready to die or something, like I had students at a certain point when I was doing something and we were doing service, learning sort of situation. And I had a couple of students who went off to a hospice. And then we were reflecting on, people were coming back from their service and they were talking about it. And I said, how was it at the hospice? And the student said, it was amazing. I said, really? I mean, you wouldn't have thought that maybe. It could have been depressing. He goes, no, these people are amazing. I said, why? He said, well, because they're focused on all the really important stuff. And they don't talk at all about all the silly stuff. And I said, well, that's an interesting idea. What's the really important stuff? And what's the silly stuff? And he said, the silly stuff is all the stuff we worry about every day. And the important stuff was relationships and caring about people And anyway, on and on and on in that vein, right? And I said, well, this is very interesting. It would be nice if we could get that insight, right, about what the really important stuff is sometime before 2 weeks before we're about to die. Right. Like maybe we could just hear this right now, today, all you little college students and me, and we could go, oh, that's the really important stuff, right? Similarly, with the afterlife, you want to say, well, what is the afterlife? And if, for example, you said, well, as I argue, the afterlife is union with the triune God. Okay, that's the theological way of putting it, right? Namely, this eternal communion of love, which is going on between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit from all eternity. And we enter into that threefold communion of love. Well, what that would tell you is, well, how would you, as you say, habituate yourself to be part of that? And the answer is, well, you'd have to, in your life, be engaged in this communion of love, which then the promise is that even death cannot separate you from that, right, communion of love. It's eternally meaningful, all right? That's the point. That's the life. Because again, if you had a notion of the afterlife, which was totally contradictory to the values and the mission that you set for this world, right? Suffer now, but you get all this good stuff later. That would be contradictory. That's what some atheists think we think. That's not what we think, right? We think that you should be devoted to a life of selfless gift of self to others because we think that's the interior life of the Trinity. And that's what heaven is. That then also becomes the importance of the communion of saints, right? Not only that we're united with God, but that we're united with all those we love.
Now, that's a fantastic way to put it. And I think it's a good pin to put on our conversation here on the first part of the show. We're speaking with Randall Smith. His book is From Here to Eternity. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back, again, talking about From Here to Eternity with Randall Smith right after these messages. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I'm going to throw it back over to you to introduce our guest.
Yeah, our guest today is Dr. Randall Smith. He is the professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, not to be confused with the one in Minneapolis. But he's written a few books here, one on Thomas Aquinas, another on Aquinas and Bonaventure. His most recent publication is From Here to Eternity, Reflections on Death, Immortality, and the Resurrection of the Body. You can find it at Emmaus Road Publishing's website or any place that you buy books. Dr. Smith, thanks again for being on.
No, it's a great pleasure.
You kind of intimated this during the first section of the interview, but like many persons and philosophers have felt throughout history that if there is no afterlife, then this life seems sort of meaningless. Like, however great it happens to be, whatever great works of art, pieces of music, buildings that we build, if it all just sort of fades to dust in the end, does it really matter? When you were talking about that, and I think your book gets into this somewhere, you talk about justice in this world, justice in the next. I wonder, like, I know in some theological circles today that universalism has become more popular again. And for myself, like, I do understand why these debates kick up, and the idea of eternal punishment is one that's difficult to wrap one's mind around. On the other hand, kind of in line with what you were saying about if there were no afterlife, if in a sense everyone has the same destination, it seems to me that sort of it kind of occludes the purpose of this life, right? Like, do our actions meaningful if all are saved or all have the this final eternal communion with God? I don't know. Do you think that's a fair critique of universalism or a place to start the conversation?
Bud's just asking the easy questions that are like
right out of the gate.
Yeah, not controversial at all.
Look, here's what I guess very minimally I would say about that, because that's a very big topic, very important, interesting. And I'm not going to make any final determination, because who could? But it seems to me what you've hit upon, there's two things. Again, this doesn't give you a whole vision of it, But there is something, it seems to me, right? Part of that unfinished business that many people have pointed to, which is to say, look, if in the end the Nazi guards at Auschwitz and Birkenau are just end up in the same way that the Jews they tortured and killed end up, something seems wrong there. Does that make sense? Something seems an unfinished business. If you somehow say, well, yeah, we tortured and killed and, made miserable and operated on all these Jewish women and children and got, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the Jews who we killed, and here we are both hanging out. And it's like, yeah, something doesn't seem right. And it seems like if Jewish people were to say, is that what you Christians are saying? We should say no. We realize something's wrong there. Now, what to say about that is complicated, because then we might say, well, there has to be at least something like purgatory. But of course, then we're going to be in a discussion with our Protestant brethren about that, right? And I say something about purgatory in the book, but I don't talk about it a lot, because I want anybody to be able to read this book. What I say about purgatory is only that to our Protestant brethren is, look, what you've got to understand about purgatory is whatever purification would be going on in purgatory to do with the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. It's not some separate thing. And the third thing I would say, and I say this to my students because this question comes up about hell, right? And I will tell them these things, but I say, all right, look, here, let me tell you something about what the Catholic Church says about this. We have this notion of saints. They are people that we believe, right, through canonical process, enjoy the beatific vision, right? There is no corresponding group that we say as a church canonically are definitely have made the decision eternally to say no to God. All right? We just don't have a category of demonic human being or something like that, right? Now, by the same token, as I say to them, you have to take very seriously the possibility that people can say no to love. You have to do that in your life, and I think you have to do that in terms of the afterlife. Namely, it would be nice if people said yes to love, but we know there are people who prefer alcohol and drugs to the love of their family. It's deeply tragic, but it happens. People look around, most of us, every day say no to love, right? And we just hold out the possibility that, is it possible that there are people who just say no? Or as Bo said, right, who say, and again, if you read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, who say, look, for example, if there's black people in heaven, I don't want to go there if somebody says that. The point is, well, you don't have to, right? Does that make sense? If that's your standard, God might very well say, well, okay. And you have to take that seriously. Has anybody done that and said an eternal no to God? Well, look, I don't know. Does it make sense? That's up to God. All right. But not to take the possibility of saying no to God. And of course, there are plenty of things in divine revelation that suggest not only that it's a possibility, but reality. I'm not denying that. I just want to say, right, you have to take that possibility seriously. And then you have to really look at history and say, oh, maybe some people have. But the only important point of saying that is to say, but I don't want to be one of those people.
Yeah, right.
I don't want to be a person who does that.
When this argument gets started, what I say is the distinction I like to make is I think you can pretty forthrightly say you can pray for any specific person. You can hope. Let me back up. You can hope any specific person is not in hell. I think with the evidence of Scripture, it doesn't make sense that you can hope that all men be saved. But I think if you take it one at a time, sure. If you want to keep considering each individual person, sure. I just think the evidence in Scripture doesn't lend itself to thinking that you should reasonably hope that all men be saved. But again, I grew up in Oklahoma by Texas, so maybe it's determined.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. The Texans. Sometimes you look at the Oklahomans and you think, well,
that's right. Exactly.
No, I get it. Yeah.
No, but this makes me think about speaking of hell, to make a devil's advocate case about something, which I think your book points at, is so there are people who go, oh, there isn't an afterlife, and actually that's the only way that life has meaning. So you have sort of Nietzschean understandings, right, that it's actually the sort of encasement of existential fact, that we only have so much time on Earth that that makes the will to power make sense, right? Because there's only this limited time, I can sort of heroically stand up against my fate and make it have meaning. You have, like there's ancient Greeks who say things that are similar. You have, postmodern, even beyond Nietzsche, where like someone like Mishima goes, the only thing that can have meaning is if you create beauty and then destroy it, right? Because then that shows our power over things we think that are eternal. People think that sort of stuff, and Christians who don't take that seriously, right? It's not something to be dismissed. And I think that's another thing that you try to get at in your book is people have deeply considered that. Whether we think piously that makes no sense, it's important for Christians to consider why people would think that's the case, and then have arguments that go counter to people who throw that out.
Yeah. The way I try to do the book, and I say this at the beginning, is I'm not, I want people to understand other views, right? And then be able to enter into a dialogue with them. And I want Christians to avoid the mistakes that I think they make. But for example, let me give you an example from a slightly different kind of not perspective, but a different kind of notion of the afterlife. I had a student say to me once, or ask me, I guess. He was kind of a surfer dude guy, and I liked him a lot. But he said to me, "Hey, Professor Smith, what if we're just in this prison of the body, and like the whole point of human life is to get the key to get out of the prison, And this is the question he asked me. He was a great kid, and to which I said, "Well, look. Was he reading Plato? I don't know. Who knows?
Right.
It didn't come out in a Platonic way. But in any case, I said, look, if that's what you think, well, then right? Because there would be nothing worse than being on your deathbed and saying, oh my God, I didn't find the key to get out of the body. I said, anybody who lives that life, seriously, you can take seriously. But you can't be some Hollywood celebrity driving around in your BMW, going to have lattes, and then say, "Oh, I'm trying to, get free from the body." That's just a lie, right? Any more than you can be a Christian and screw over your workers and treat people badly and say, "Oh, I'm a devoted Christian. I believe in the afterlife." No, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
This makes this gets the heart of when I think of on all this too is like you'll have people who are like, there's no morality, and I'm like, you're driving the speed limit. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you live up to you're polite and follow all of the dumb rules that if there were no morality, no one would follow. So don't lie to me. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's, and here's the thing, right, about that. Right, let me just finish with the kid. But I said to him, and then I'll talk to your point because I think it's a good one. I said to the kid, but look, if you're asking me, which I guess you are, but I mean, it's not up to me, right? Obviously, I don't get to choose. But if you're asking me, I quite like having a body. I don't really like this particular body, whatever. But I mean, I like hugs. I like smell. I like touch. I like taste. I like all these things. So the notion of freeing myself from the body where you have none of that is not particularly attractive to me. So if you think of your body as this horrible thing that you want to get rid of, well, then you do. What can I tell you, right? That's the only thing that's going to make sense to you. But if you like hugs and kisses and sex and smell and looking at sunsets, well, then you want a body. That's all I can tell you, right? And he kind of looked at me and said, well, okay, yeah, well, anyway, so take the one with the other. Right? Does it make sense? Again, how are you living your life and how do you envision the afterlife? And there's going to be a relationship. So it's true if people say, if there is no God and there is no afterlife, well, then it's true. You're going to be a Nazi guard instead of the person the Nazi guard is torturing. because it's like, why would I not be the one rather than the other? And you just have to take that seriously. Here's my response to your issue about that, though. Here's the problem. Every parent and everybody has somewhere in their life a thing. It could be following the traffic laws, but there's somebody they love. Somebody that they love selflessly. And when they do that, they let the cat out of the bag. You don't really believe that there's nothing in the universe but just material stuff and it's all pointless. Deep down, you know it's true. Selfless gift of love to others is fundamental. And that's the life you really want to live. You just don't have the courage to do it. But you've let the cat out of the bag. There's a place that you know, right? And all we're saying is, yep, that's the truth. And that's what heaven is, right?
That's right. Dr. Smith, I love these stories that you have from your conversations with students. And one thing that your book wonderfully gets into is sort of the way that Christianity stood out in the ancient world and its understanding of the body and the resurrection of the body. I sense, like, even in the Catholic Church today, like in the level of the pews, that there's been some drift on this topic. And what I mean by that is, like, so I grew up in a more like evangelical revivalist community, and sometimes you'd hear language that to me sounded disconsonant with what Scripture teaches us about the resurrection of the body. You know, people say sort of sentimentally, like, my grandma's an angel now or something like that. And we would do, instead of like funerals, you know, and of course this does get into like differences in terms of the understanding of purgatory and penance and things like that, but where we would call it a celebration of life. But I sense even in Catholicism, especially when I compare sort of like devotional works today with what you see from even 75 years ago, but certainly like 200, 300 years ago, that there's less of an attention to, our need for mercy even after death. But I think even with even our understanding of the resurrection of the body, I don't know, like it seems almost like it's become like a difficult concept. Like a lot of people are willing to consider, like, yes, my loved one in some way lives on eternally, like is in an immortal state, but I can't conceptualize the resurrection of the body. Do you sense that sort of drift with your students where they're at?
This has always been a problem. And Paul says, it's right. It's a scandal to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. Another Ralph McInerney story, if I may, which was Ralph McInerney was, while he was a professor at Notre Dame, he would tell the story about how he was teaching a student about the resurrection of the body. And he said, well, you see, this is why Aristotle was having an Aristotelian philosophy was so much more useful for Thomas Aquinas to help us understand the resurrection of the body, right? Because the soul is a substantial form of the body. Therefore, there's this fundamental unity. Anyway, this student heard this and he was like, oh my goodness, Ralph McInerney is teaching heresy. And he went to the dean and he said, Ralph McInerney is teaching heresy. He's talking about the resurrection of everybody's body. He thought only Christ had a resurrection of the body and no one else did. And for some reason, I don't know why, I never quite got this clear. He said, McInerney's teaching Unitarianism. And the dean, I think, of course, being a good guy and friends with Fabian, I think, sort of calmed him down and said, well, actually, like what? And I have this with students all the time too, right? They're like, wait a minute, Christ was resurrected, but they're like, no, there's a general resurrection. In Paul, right, he talks about it as part of the creed. We say in the creed, and I believe in the resurrection of the body, life everlasting. Okay, people say that every time they go to Mass, and still people are like, wait a minute, resurrection of the body? How does that happen? But, well, it's part of the faith. It's not up to me, right?
Yeah.
Now, there's reasons why I think it's a good idea, right? I like the idea myself, as I mentioned, but I think people have problems with this because they've been trained to think that, you just become an angel or something. Angels are not, even in wonderful movies like It's a Wonderful Life, dead people do not become angels. Angels are a completely different thing, right?
No, this is so. The fact of the matter is, speaking of things that we would love to keep talking about, we're at the end of our time here. I actually think this must be a good way to sort of throw people over to the book because, like I said, I wanted to talk about the section where you talk about transhumanism and sort of the idea that we can cheat death through the manipulation of the body. We didn't even get to that. Folks, there's just so much you want to make sure to go dive deeply into in this book. So, Dr. Smith, one more time, tell folks what the book's title is and the best place they can go get it.
First of all, you can listen to this podcast and then you'll know everything that's important in the book, right? Other than the thing you just mentioned. And no. And so it's From Here to Eternity, Reflections on Death, Immortality, and the Resurrection of the Body. They can get it through Emmaus Press. Emmaus Press was Scott Hahn's press that he started, right? I mean, they have their own existence now, but, there's a lot of sort of Scott Hahn books, et cetera, he started. They're a wonderful little, eager press, and they have many, many really wonderful books, many much more wonderful than mine. So go look them up. But, of course, you can also find the book on Amazon or any of those places, right? If you don't want to go to Amazon, that's fine. Then just go to Emmaus or go to, any other one of these places, and you can find it. I don't check online all the time to see where you can get it, but I mean, people tell me that they get it all around at different places, so like including Amazon.
We'll make sure it's at Divine Treasures here, the local Catholic bookstore in Des Moines.
But Dr. Smith, it's been fantastic. We've had an absolute blast. I hope this really gets people looking for your book and go getting it. So thank you one more time for being on the show.
Thank you.
This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll close out the show right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this weekend. Thank you for listening to the show. Wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for listening either throughout Iowa on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network, iowacatholicradio.com, if that's how you meet up with us, so to speak, with the show. Yeah. The Iowa Catholic Radio app, of course, anywhere that you have data. And then,
I love the app. The app is great, and data is, do you say, I think data when you're talking about
singular.
Phones.
Yeah. Datum. You like particular data.
No, you need data.
Yeah, that's right. And then, of course, the podcast, which I'm a fan of the podcast, fan of the pod. So thank you for listening to our show. Bud, what a trip to death and back. Thank you to Randall Smith for making that a very interesting show. And I hope people see I don't know if there's a better way to dwell on the difference resurrection makes except on this weekend for Easter.
No, he's one of those interviews where, as I was listening to him on the radio, I was like, that would be a fun professor to have, I think he'd be a whippersnapper in class, a firecracker, as it were.
Well, we here at Iowa Catholic Radio, I hope people see our firecracker-type nature, that we're very excited about this season, but to continue the season and the joyful prayers that they can join on. If people want to join us in our joyful prayers of the Easter season, what are ways that they can do so? Yeah, please do. As Bo's already mentioned, the app, so you can use the app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere, but we also broadcast the rosary at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., and then the Divine Mercy Chaplet at 2:55 in the afternoon, the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. I think it's fine to say it either way, but that's right before 3 p.m. And so, Bud, we have plenty of stuff going on in and around not only the Diocese of Des Moines, but in the listening area of Iowa Catholic Radio. But people can go check that out. The one that I am looking forward to is we have, of course, the golf tournament showing up, I think, in May, that people can go check that out. We have a ringer this year from Mercy College of Health Sciences. That's right. We're going to win. No, she can't counteract how bad we truly are. Well, I do want to throw out one more thing with Mercy College. Folks, April 14th, this coming Friday, we have the inauguration Mass, which is at 9 a.m. at St. Ambrose Cathedral, 9 a.m., April 14th. Yeah. We would love to have you there. Celebrate Mass and pray for our new president, Dr. Adrian Henry. I think this is his 9th month, so he really is sort of raring to go. And we hope that you'll be able to join us in prayer as we have our inauguration festivities April 14th. But finally, Bud, just so people can keep it in mind, I know we got through Lent, you gave your alms, but it's Easter. If you are happy to be a part of this ministry, which you, of course, who are listeners are, please find it in your heart when you have the time to think about prayerfully donating to Iowa Catholic Radio. You can do that at iowacatholicradio.com. Call 515-223-1150. Different ways that you can continue this ministry among all of us. So once again, thank you. Bud, I hope that as we gear up to celebrate the Easter festival, that you don't slack off and that you make sure to enjoy yourself. With it's commanded to be joyful at this point, Bud.
Yeah, many blessings to you and yours. And this is an easy part of the Catholic faith to lean into for me, the Easter season.
Yeah, no,
I know I grumble and mumble during Lent, but I'm a full-on Easter guy.
We're ready to go. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our family, city, state, nation, planet, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. Praise be to God. Celebrate the fact of the empty grave because Christ is risen indeed. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.